Every day there are more poll numbers in the presidential race, and all the polls are slightly or at times significantly different. What should people think of all these numbers? In 2016, almost all the polls were wrong, saying Hillary Clinton would beat Donald Trump handily. Could that kind of widespread swing and a miss happen this year? Good evening and welcome to Talking Points. I'm Esme Murphy. With less than 3 weeks to Election Day, there are new poll results out every day. And Election Day itself is something of a misnomer. More than 5 million Americans have already voted in early voting. That includes more than 220,000 people in Minnesota. In fact, only 3 states do not allow early voting. They are Mississippi, Alabama, and New Hampshire. What impact do those early votes have? Are polls better than they were in 2016? Is this race really that close? And what are some of the things voters need to know about polls in general? Well, these are just some of the questions I will ask our experts, both partisan and nonpartisan. Let's start with Hamline professor David Schultz. Well, joining us right now is Professor David Schultz of Hamline University. Thank you so much for coming on.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me, Esme.
All right. What are people to make of all these polls? And nearly all of them say this is an incredibly tight race, if not deadlocked, not only nationally, but also in the key states.
Yeah. Well, first off, I tell people 2 things when thinking about polls. First off, remember, polls are not predictors. They're a snapshot in time, and things can change. Second, ignore all the national polls. And by that, we don't elect the president by national popular vote. What's really critical to look at are the polls in the swing states, and they are close. And I think the most important thing we need to understand at this point is that polls, when they say somebody has a lead by, let's say, 46 to 45, they also say with a margin of error oftentimes of 2 to 3 points. And that's what's critical, because what we have seen really for the last 2 months or 3 months is real stability in public opinion, and all the variance that's going on is well within this margin of error. So if 1 week you see Trump up by 1, the next week you see Harris up by 1, this is just normal.
And that what you're saying, it doesn't mean anything, because
it doesn't mean anything whatsoever. Or if you were to say a month ago, Harris had a 3-point lead, plus or minus 3 points, and now she has a lead or of 1 point or is dead even. Does that mean she's slipping? No. Does that mean she's tied? We don't know. All of this is operating within a margin of error. And right now, again, the most interesting thing in American politics is just this incredible stability that even if we go back to before, when it was Biden versus Trump, the polls were very close. They're still very close now. Nothing has really shifted in months.
What also is a factor is that there are more than 5 million Americans, including more than 220,000 right here in Minnesota, that have already voted. What impact does that make? I mean, can you really poll with that? I mean, it seems like that would complicate things.
It makes things a little bit harder because you now have people who have already voted. But one of the things that we need to understand also is, if we take into account the fact that the polls do have these margins of error, the polls have been within the margins of error, been mostly correct, the good polls. I mean, there's a lot of bad polling out there. But for example, at the national level, polls such, for example, like the New York Times Siena poll, the Wall Street Journal poll are very, very good in terms of what they're doing. But we have to sort of be, I'll say, discerning in looking at the polls, because, again, some of them are better, but also understanding the fact that at the end of the day, we are looking at 150,000 to 200,000 voters across 6 or so swing states that are going to determine the election. Figuring out if they're going to show up or not is critical. And one of the things I want to argue is that among the group of people who is really hard to poll right now are young people under the age of 30, that they seem much more motivated to vote now than it was with Harris than with Biden. But getting them to answer their phone, to respond to texts, to figuring out if they're going to show up to vote, that is difficult. And I think that's one of the biggest variables in the election right now, what they are going to do.
Interesting. You obviously deal with a lot of young people as a professor. I want to ask you, you suggested don't look at the national polls. Without going into an explanation of how the Electoral College works, because I think most people who are interested in politics know a little bit about that. They all the national polls seem to suggest that Kamala Harris does have a lead there, which suggests, does that suggest to you that once again what we could have here is Kamala Harris winning the popular vote and possibly losing the electoral college?
Yeah, I think that's a real possibility again. If that were to happen, that would be the third time in 24 years. It happened in 2000, 2016, and again. It seems that Trump has sort of about a 46, 47% support, and that's remained stable over the years. Uh, but his support is more concentrated in those critical swing states. The Democrats rack up huge majorities in California and New York, but they're not as well balanced in those states like Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. So I'm increasingly thinking that we're going to have that split yet again.
All right. Well, thank you, Professor David Schultz. Thank you so much. Really interesting point about young voters that they don't respond to texts and phone calls. I know that personally too.
I was gonna say, for every parent out there who's trying to reach their kid, they know exactly what I'm talking about.
All right. Thank you so much. We really appreciate your time.
Right. Bye. See you later.
Up next, different perspectives from Professor Larry Jacobs of the Humphrey School and Democratic analyst Abou Amara. Well, joining us is Professor Larry Jacobs of the Humphrey School. Thank you so much for coming on.
Great to be with you.
What should the public make of all of these polls that really show basically the same thing? They all seem to indicate this race is incredibly close.
The polls aren't going to tell you anything anymore, other than this is a toss-up. There's a margin of error, which is statistically telling us that if the results are generally within 3 points or so, we can't have any confidence in the estimates that are being made. So I think folks need to kind of chill out on the poll consumption. If it shows Kamala Harris up by 1.5 points or Donald Trump gaining 1 point, it doesn't really tell you a whole lot. I think the key thing to know is this race is as close as we've seen. It may be another, photo finish like we saw in 2016 and 2020.
In terms of the fact that many of the polls are similar, you can't, one poll, yes, it's all within the margin of error. Does that mean anything?
It means the same thing, which is this is just a very, very close race. I think it's going to come down to the voters who have not made up their mind or say they haven't made up their mind. It looks to be about 5% or so.
Okay.
Those people know a few things, one of which is they're maybe uncomfortable with the last 4 years, which is not going to be good news for Kamala Harris. There's also 3, 4, 5% who are supporting a third party candidate. It's not uncommon for those voters to kind of melt away and come back to one of the major parties. So that's where the change is going to come from. I don't think it's from these polls of Harris and Trump, which we're getting inundated with.
How do you think the campaigns are handling with these polls? What do you think people do when they see polls that are that tight and they're running a campaign?
I was talking to a pretty senior Democratic consultant, and she said, you got to run through the tape, which is shorthand for a runner who is getting near the finish line. And rather than slowing down, you got to sprint right through the tape. And so the message to both campaigns by their own people is do not let up. It may come down to a few thousand votes in Pennsylvania or another state. You got to fight for every vote. And there's a kind of a frantic pace that's starting to really stick.
I know that in Wisconsin, they're door knocking in ways. I know that even here in Minnesota, they're door knocking in ways. Republicans, that's not so much their strategy, the ground game. Your thoughts about that? And also Kamala Harris has a lot more money. We've been seeing a lot more Kamala Harris ads. What do you think about these two ways of doing things?
Well, there's no doubt that the Democrats appear to be running a more traditional get out the vote campaign. They're door knocking. They've got terrific lists of voters they think are theirs if they get them to the polls. That's the way it's been done. The Republicans are going a different route. They're counting on the Trump voters in the past to beat Trump voters this year. They're not going to be really after them as much. And then they're relying on these kind of for-hire firms to do a lot of that work. But it needs to be said that the Republicans have an advantage in terms of registering new votes. If you look in Pennsylvania and other states, you'll see that more of the registrations are being put into a Republican column. That's big because most of the voters who turn out, of course, are registered. So there are a lot of different things going on here. It's, I think, hard to kind of predict which candidate is going to emerge at the top.
When do you think we'll know the results?
You know, I think it's unlikely it's going to be an election night, to be honest. I think this is going to be so close. It'll take days and weeks really for each state that's close to have their election officials go through and do what's called a canvass, a checking of the list of voters and then the ballots. And then there'll be things called post-election audits. This is one of those things where people need to take a deep breath. It's going to be a very close election in all likelihood, and it's just going to take time to make sure we have it right.
Well, Larry Jacobs, always a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us.
Good to be with you.
Joining us right now is Abou Amara, Democratic analyst. Thank you, Abou, for coming on.
Thanks for having me, Esme.
All right, my question to you is polling. All these polls are very, very similar. They're very tight. What should people think going in?
Yeah, I think it's two things. First, remember that polling is a snapshot in time, right? So it's important to know where you are today, but that could change in the future. And also it could be a departure from where you were in the past. That's number one. And number two, I think it's important to look at trend lines in polling, meaning don't look at one poll, look at a ton of polls. And second, what are the polls telling you over the past week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks? And a combination of those two things, I think can give you a good sense of where the state of the race is.
Okay. A lot of people go back to 2016 and say, well, the polls were all wrong. And they almost all were. There was one poll that was actually right back in 2016 consistently. All the other polls had Hillary Clinton winning. Obviously, that was wrong. Have they changed their methods since 2016?
Yeah, I think there's no question that pollsters have learned the nuances of the Trump campaign itself and the support level. And so they're trying to poll in different ways to capture that. I will say, I think it's still a bit difficult. Historically, the polling has underpolled Donald Trump by 3 to 5 percentage points. And so pollsters, I think,
even in 2020.
Even in 2020 and particularly in 2016. And so I think pollsters are factoring that into how they weigh the overall universe of voters. And so I suspect, look, it's a data point. It shouldn't be determinative, but it tells us kind of the tapestry of the race, if you will.
And as a snapshot in time, how does that differ, though, with so many people have already voted? 5 million people, more than 5 million people across the country have voted. The election's still, weeks out. How does that change polling? It must do something to it.
Yeah, it does. And so what it does is you have your universe and you decide, okay, these people are going to turn out. That's the universe of voters. But as people vote, you can actually take them out of the universe and then calculate who should we be adding to the universe to try to win to get our electoral win number. And so it informs the campaigns in terms of who you reach out to next, right? It's not just a question of who already supports you, but who can you go to as most likely to support you. So every day they're running new models and every day they're sending folks to people's doors saying, knocking on their doors to get them out to vote. That's what the early vote does with the polling.
And the campaigns themselves, I mean, you've worked on campaigns, you study campaigns, you've got certainly know so many people involved in campaigns. How do they look at the polling, and are they looking at it, even though it's just a snapshot in time, and responding to it? Are they changing tactics or going different places because of the polling?
Absolutely. The polling is driving nearly every decision of the campaign, where you're going to campaign, who you're going to talk to, the messages you want to get across, and the timing in which you're going to do that, right? So, for example, Kamala Harris recently has come out with a bold agenda for African-American men. That's not an accident. That's a fact because the polling is showing there's some slippage with African-American men, particularly in Milwaukee, Detroit, and Philadelphia, and she's hoping to stop the bleeding in that space. That's an example of how the polling can drive political campaigns.
And what do you think is going on with that point, with African-American men in general?
Yeah, the gender gap, it cuts both ways with Democrats and Republicans. But I would say when it comes to men, I do think there's a cultural phenomenon happening here where a lot of men are getting squeezed economically, their family formation issues. And so there's a combination of factors with men feeling like maybe their role is being displaced on some level, right? And we can debate that to what it means, but I think from a polling and electoral standpoint, it's something that the Democrats have to watch out for. This used to be kind of the union block of the Democratic Party, working class, middle class folks, and Democrats are starting to slip in that space. And I think there's a message to get them back, but it's clear it's an issue that the Kamala campaign is going to have to deal with.
And do you think, I mean, that's such an interesting point. Do you think that's especially true of black men? Because even though Kamala Harris is leading, but by a large margin with black men, she's not leading by as much as Joe Biden did 4 years ago.
Yeah, I do. I think it's a combination of economics. I think it's coming out of COVID. There's displacement. There's this sense of feeling like you're not in control of your own life. And I think that's particularly true for a lot of middle class African American men who've worked all their life and may not have a lot of savings to show for it or a house to show for it. So there are real legitimate issues that I think not just in the next 21 days, but moving forward, the Democratic Party is going to have to figure out.
All right. Well, Abou Amara, thank you so much. It's always a pleasure.
Thanks for having me, Esme.
Up next, we'll hear a Republican point of view from GOP analyst Amy Koch. Well, joining me right now is Republican analyst Amy Koch. What are Republicans supposed to make of all these polls that are out in the presidential race? Most show a tight race, almost all of them show a tight race, but there are different numbers within these polls.
Yeah, for sure. And polls, I think, are so frustrating to everybody, right? Because it just feels like one day your candidate's up, one day your candidate's down, and what do you really believe? But a couple things about polls, that they are a snapshot and that you have to take an aggregate. So I always look at, a 538 or Real Clear Politics to sort of see what are the average of all the polls doing.
And those are two really great websites, folks, as you're listening. Real Clear Politics, and which other one did you say?
And 538.
538, yes, that's the New York Times one.
Average.
If you want to look at stuff, they're really good.
They're outstanding. And so that's the first thing. Look at an average. Don't take just one CNN poll or one CBS poll. As good as they might be, it's just a snapshot. And the second thing is, what are the trends, right? And so in this, for the Republicans, obviously, Donald Trump was on a trajectory to win when Biden was still in. The assassination attempt, the debate debacle, the RNC, the polls were he was starting to really pull away. Well, Vice President Harris then jumped in the race and blunted that. And at the time, I thought, well, let's see what kind of a bounce. And of course, then all the news is about picking the vice president, the DNC, and her poll numbers climbed. But I never saw them climb to a point where I was like, oh, she's got a commanding lead. They climbed, but they didn't climb enough. And what we're seeing is those polls have now settled back. And particularly, not just the national poll, which I think she's around 1.5 to 2 points above in the national poll, which is meaningless because we don't use that. We use the electoral college. And so in those battleground states, of the 7 battlegrounds, Trump has been persistently and consistently, except for a very tiny bump, in the lead. In 6 of the 7 battlegrounds. Wisconsin is the only exception. And frankly, it's like a point or two bump for Harris or above for Harris. So if that holds with no toss-ups, Donald Trump wins this election. He has more than the required 270 electoral college votes to win the presidency.
Let me ask you, I think a lot of people remember 2016 when all the polls, with I think one exception, got it wrong and all had Hillary Clinton, winning the election. They were wrong, of course. We got President Donald Trump. Could that happen again?
Sure. I also think with Trump, because he's such an anomaly, I think people are just hesitant to talk about a vote or a not vote for him, because on both sides, people are so fired up, right? If you're MAGA, right, he's super intense about you must vote for him. He's the greatest. And if you aren't, so often you get there's so much vitriol and hate, against and opposed. And so a lot of people, I think, just don't register. But the other point is,
they don't register with the poll. You mean they're not getting polled?
The poll. They don't talk about it. They're very quiet about their support for Donald Trump. I think there's a fair number built in. However, in 2022, what we saw, which should have been a wave year for Republicans, it was the second year, or the midterm for the Biden administration. The economy was a disaster. Public safety was a big issue. We saw a very, very quiet women's vote on the Supreme Court decision on abortion. And that was seismic enough to really—
And unexpected
and did not register as well. So I also think there's something about where people are just hesitant to respond to polls. They're just like, I'm just going to go vote. I'm going to do my thing. It's nobody's business. Leave me alone.
You know, it's interesting. You brought up the point that Donald Trump really is sort of an outlier. The normal rules, the normal way you look at elections, it seemed to be saying you seem to be saying you can't do that with Donald Trump. Can you explain that?
Yeah, well, I wish I could, because I could more accurately predict this. But he is just, when you have a cult of personality that is not about a position, right? He moves his positions. His positions are not recognizable to me as a longtime conservative Republican. They're just not. And so he's able to maneuver that because for a lot of his supporters, it isn't about his position. It isn't about his conservative. People always say, well, the far right or the very conservative. I'm like, that's not who this is. These are Donald Trump supporters and they love him. And I also think it doesn't translate to even his kids necessarily or his acolytes. He is of himself sort of this force that for whatever reason, people have really imprinted on. And then also he just follows no rules, right? He doesn't do the traditional interviews. He doesn't,
and that doesn't hurt him.
It doesn't hurt him at all. He stands on stage 2 days ago for 30 minutes, dancing to music and not answering questions. And it will be a forgotten thing by the time this segment airs. Like no one will remember it.
All right. Well, Amy Koch, thank you so much. We really appreciate your input.
I appreciate it. Thanks, Esme.
And that does it for this edition of Talking Points. The show streams free on CBS News Minnesota. As always, please email me with comments or suggestions at esme@cbs.com. The show streams for free on CBS News Minnesota every Wednesday and Thursday at 6:30 and 9:30 p.m. It also posts on YouTube on Fridays for on-demand viewing. Thanks so much for watching. I'm Esme Murphy, WCCO News.